Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the kickoff event for uh, Edit-a-thon. Welcome to the kickoff panel discussion for the Black Histories Wikipedia and Wikidata Edit-a-thon. I am Rianne, and I'm going to be your host for today. I am currently in my third year at the University of Toronto, doing a double major in environmental biology and global health with a minor in statistics. Now I'm going to introduce our moderator, who is Natasha Henry Dixon, and our distinguished panel, Melissa J. Nelson and Tonya Sutherland-Stewart. And I'm pretty happy to be the host of this event. It was pretty much an honor, I think, talking about like Black history and placing the spotlight on, being able to edit digital medias and, to share Black stories, I think is pretty important. And yes. So before we go into the event, I'm going to briefly acknowledge the land that we are currently on. So I know we're currently in a virtual space, and I think it's still important to do that in order to honor the people who were on the land before us and who are currently still inhabit on the land. So as we gather virtually today, it is with respect and humility that we acknowledge the Indigenous lands from which we all join. Though online, this event takes place on lands steeped in rich Indigenous histories and present-day communities. We're connecting from various locations, yet many of us are on lands that have been cared for through generations by Indigenous peoples. And I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which is on traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This land is part of Treaty 15, and it remains a living reflection of the diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who have continued to enrich this land. As someone living, working, and studying on this land, I acknowledge my position as a settler and the impact our institutions, such as the Toronto Metropolitan University, Toronto Public Library, the University of Toronto, and York University have on these lands. It is our collective responsibility to recognize our role in this history and to honor the original caretakers of this land, acknowledging the enduring presence and resilience of First Nation people. The legacies of colonialism are visible and ongoing, with profound effects on Indigenous communities, cultures, and languages. The strategies of the residential school system and the systematic injustices Indigenous people face are a stark reminder of the long path towards healing and reconciliation. It is upon us to support Indigenous sovereignty, rights, and environmental stewardship, acknowledging the leadership of Indigenous peoples in the fight for climate justice and the protection of land and water. In recognition of these truths, we commit to learning, listening, and acting with respect and responsibility towards a future that honors Indigenous sovereignty and fosters genuine reconciliation. As we proceed with our event, let us reflect on the significance of the land beneath our feet, wherever we may be, and express our gratitude towards those who have cared for it through the ages. Let this acknowledgement be a step towards understanding and honoring the past and present, and a call to all participants to consider the impact of their own present on Indigenous lands. We are grateful for the opportunity to gather in this space and for Indigenous peoples who continue to share the land and wisdom with us. So before we get into the event, I kind of want to dive into a bit about what Edit-a-thon is and the meaning behind the organization. So wait, my next slide. So Black Histories Wikipedia and Edit-a-thon is basically what's created in 2020 to celebrate Black History Month by enhancing the representation of Black histories and Wikipedia and Wikidata with a focus on Toronto and Canada. So this is basically an annual series, and it opens avenues for everyone to contribute to amplifying Black stories, Black voices in digital archives. And this is a collaborative project between staff and students from the Toronto Metropolitan University, Toronto Public Library, the University of Toronto, and York. And basically, it's pretty much full of community, and it's pretty much everyone's trying to get involved to really amplify Black voices in Wikipedia and Wikidata through enhancing stories and that. Thank you. So how can you get involved? So you can join an event. So this option includes both online and in-person options. And if you go to our website, you can find all the links to register for the online and in-person events. And then you can also participate on your own. So it caters to individuals who maybe prefer to do this in their own time or maybe cannot attend an event at the time. So yes. And now I'm going to be showing you like a brief overview of some of the calendar of events that we have before I introduce our panelists and moderator. So this is kind of like a little kind of overview. So in green, we have all the online sessions, and in gray, we have all the in-person events. So today, I think, which is a pretty important event. So it's a Black only discussion space for Black Histories, Wikipedia and Edit-a-thon. So basically it's a follow-up discussion from the panel discussion. So if you maybe have any unanswered questions that you'd like to talk about, or maybe talk a bit more about some of the themes and topics that we have discussed here, then definitely register for this event. Yes. And then here are some of our other upcoming events. So on February 7th, we have the Black History in Glam Edit-a-thon. And on the 8th, there's the Edit-a-thon plus Wikipedia and Wikidata training. So this event is open to everyone. It's for beginners as well. So if you have no experience, that's perfectly fine. The first half of the session is basically dedicated to kind of like going through and going over some of the basics. So it's pretty fine. It's beginner friendly. And if you also do have some experience, that's also fine. You can also like just join, I guess, to make some friends, and do some editing together. And then on February 9th, there's a Wikipedia Edit-a-thon, and this is only open to U of T students. So, if you're U of T students like myself, we can maybe go to the Innis College Resident event room and check it out. And then on February 13th, we have the Wikipedia Edit-a-thon for York U students only. And then as well, on the same day, we have the one for UTM students as well. And then on February 15th, we have the Edit-a-thon, Wikipedia and Wikidata training. This is also similar to the event ran on February 8th. It's the exact same thing. Maybe if you can attend the one on the 8th, you can attend the one on the 15th. That's completely fine. And then on the 16th, which is the last event, it's Black STEM Histories Wikipedia Edit-a-thon. Yes. So if you want to attend any of these events, you can go click on the chat and you can find the link to register via the website. Thank you. Stop screen share. Okay, so now I am going to introduce our panelists. So we'll first start off with Melissa J. Nelson. So Melissa J. Nelson is an activist she works as an activist for the Archives of Toronto as a leading voice in the field of archival studies on issues of race and racism. Her work is grounded in an ethics of care for the representation of Black cultural heritage and of anti-Black archival materials. She produces and hosts the podcast Archives and Things. And in 2020, she published a post on her blog titled Archiving Hate Racist Materials in Archive, which was cited widely and referenced by various institutions in their statements of commitment to equity practices. Melissa is the founder and creative director of the Black Memory Collective, which is a community for Black archivists, memory workers, and researchers who engage with the archives in Canada. Next, we'll be moving on to Tonya Sutherland-Stewart, who is a museum professional, an early age career heritage professional with a background in English and history. Tonya Sutherland-Stewart is a Belleville-based graduate of the Masters of Museum Studies program at the University of Toronto. She is drawn to community-related heritage and has worked on archival projects at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Centre, Bruce County Museum and Cultural Centre, the Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto, and the Archives. Tonya first became curious about Black Canadian history when she realized that despite being a Black Canadian and majoring in history during university, she knew very little about the history of Black communities in Canada. For her master's capstone project, Tonya conducted a feasibility study for the development of a digital archive for the Jackson Project, which is a multi-platform, not-for-profit created to explore, memorialize, and create the history of the Emancipation Day celebrations that took place in Windsor, Ontario. Now we'll talk about Dr. Natasha Henry Dixon, teaches in the professional stream in the Department of History. The current research of the 2020 Vander Scholar focuses on the enslavement of Black people in colonial Ontario. Her publications include Emancipation Day Celebrating Freedom in Canada, published in 2010, Talking About Freedom, Celebrating Freedom in Canada, published in 2012, and several entries for the Canadian Encyclopedia on African Canadian History. Professor Dixon has developed educational resources for several projects on the Black experience in Canada. Her work is grounded in a commitment to research, collect, preserve, and disseminate the histories of African Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rhianne, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us in this conversation today. I just wanted to situate our conversation. We are in the first few days into Black History Month, and the reason for our conversation is all of us in some way have come to efforts, personal and collective efforts to reclaim Black histories, which, the processes that have led to that are very important to understand. And so I just wanted to briefly share a statement that I like to share to help focus our conversations, that it was also important for us to acknowledge Indigenous Africans who were forcefully removed from their native lands and dispersed across the New World. This involuntary migration heavily contributed to the movement of African-descended people across the African diaspora in places like Canada. As students and as learners and as the general public, we feel that it's very necessary to think deeper and to examine these processes that led to the dispossession of Indigenous people on this land and settler colonialism, stolen people on stolen land. In entering our conversation about the long-lasting legacies and impact of these processes, it is important for us to center the humanity of Black people and to examine the systems that have acted upon them. And so I just wanted to say that to focus us. So Melissa and Tonya, great to be with you. As I mentioned, all of us in some way have come to be drawn to our work to preserve and to share Black stories in the past and in the present. And so I wanted to begin by asking each of you, what was your motivation to start researching in Black Canadian experiences? What inspired you to do the work that you do in museum studies, in archival studies, obviously connected to history and sociology? What has been the impetus for your journey so far? Melissa, would you like to start?
Sure. I think our stories are probably similar, me and Tanya's. For me, it started with me trying to make sense of who I was as a Black person in this country, right? Growing up with a hyphenated identity, my parents are from Jamaica. I was born here. And so I was always trying to make sense of what does it mean to be Black in this country? What does it mean to have Black culture in Canada? And my mom really did a good job of trying to introduce me to my heritage, but also to Black experiences in Canada. But the invisibility of Blackness in this country was really something that affected me. And so eventually I came to study history in my undergrad and went to Carleton. And then I studied information studies for my master's at McGill. And I became an archivist. I work at the Archives of Ontario. And my work is really about helping other Black people who have the same experience as me, helping us to reframe the stories that we tell about ourselves, about the past, about who we are as a people, and understanding that there's so much more to our stories than, what we hear in the textbooks when we were in school.
Mhm. Thank you. Tonya, what about yourself?
Yeah, I think like Melissa said, we start from a very similar position. I come from a family of people who immigrated from St. Vincent, so the Caribbean as well, in the 50s. And I know that this specific kind of topic, my interest, I can trace it back to, or a more active interest, to a moment when I'd finished my undergraduate. I was considering applying for a master's in museum studies. And I was just kind of thinking about history, Canadian identity. And I kind of just had this realization of like, I was a history major through university. I specifically sought out and took multiple courses dealing with like Black history in the world. And then thinking about that, I was like, but somehow we never really talked about Canadian Black history or Black people in Canada, beyond the like, and then they arrived via the Underground Railroad to Canada and the
Mhm.
end, I guess. And I was at a point where I was like, I don't. There's got to be a little more to that story. There's got to be more there. It's just that in the course of my education, unfortunately, I haven't really been exposed to the specific experience of Black Canadians, and so I was kind of thinking about that, and turning over my mind at this time, I guess, early 2018, when I connected also with Kathy and Audra, my colleagues at the Jackson Park Project. And, Audra in particular had this idea of exploring the history of the Emancipation Day celebrations and parades in Windsor. And we kind of got talking, and I thought that this would be a really great avenue to explore my own interest, my desire to learn more about Black Canadian history, and also like Canadian history in a more fulsome context, and to also share that with others, because I think many other people are in the same situation of just not really being exposed to that history at all. So that's kind of where it kicked off for me.
And for me, that would make it 3 for 3. That is exactly for myself what happened. I was born in Toronto, and my parents are from Jamaica. And so it's a feeling of, yes, you have those strong connections to where your parents are from, but you're also not from there, right? And so you are born somewhere and you trying to figure out what are the connections to a Black presence in the space that you're in. And for me, that was very much a driving force for wanting to learn more. I always say, like, I had the question, like, how long were Black people here? Like, were our parents the ones who came here at first, or there's a huge gap between what you kind of briefly learn about the Underground Railroad and your parents, right, arriving to Canada. Like, what was the in between? And so for myself, that is what led me to research about Black history. And I remember coming across or finding the book Freedom Seekers by Daniel Hill in the library. And just, I don't know how many times I took that book out, just going through that book. And really, that just kind of propelled me to say, I have to learn more. I became so interested, so engrossed, so much so that I studied Black history, African Canadian history, African history. And then as an educator, just, I wanted students to learn about this in the classroom so that they didn't necessarily have to go through similar, struggles of having to find that information on their own, like I did and like we did. Mhm. A lot of the work increasingly that we are doing in the respective fields and in an effort to document and to preserve Black history, increasingly it relies on digital technologies and in its many forms. What roles how have you used digital technologies in your work, and what role do you think that they can play, including online tools like Wikipedia, in constructing and sharing stories about Black Canadians? Maybe I'll go the reverse this time, Tonya.
Sure thing. Yeah, I can say definitely in a kind of academic context, I have relied very heavily on, the wonder of the academic research databases like JSTOR and the rest. Those, of course, are an amazing wealth of knowledge and access to articles, I think, and publications, especially things about more, quote unquote, niche topics like Black Canadian history. But that's an interesting question as well because it's also a challenge of access. Having now finished my degree, you lose your free subscription or whatever to JSTOR after you graduate, and the question of like, how do I digital scholarly sources do increase my access to academic research, but then how do you go on after that if you don't no longer have that access, or say you don't have kind of the ability to, I'm going to subscribe to these 5 academic journals or whatever and pay for that and then like go on with that as well. So that's both like a great opportunity, but also a challenge, especially when you're thinking about like trying to do research over like a long period of time. So yeah, that's something I've been kind of thinking about myself and turning over in my mind.
And what about in terms of, so in one thing you're talking about access to these, resources. How about in the work that you do in terms of your research and collecting information? What kinds of digital tools have you been using, and how have you found them to be important, I guess, to your work?
Yeah, so I would say that it's an extremely important question to my work because within Jackson Park, my kind of role is kind of leading the development and kind of building up the structure of some kind of digital archive where we're able to, the ultimate goal being that we want to be able to kind of collect all of this information about particularly emancipation in Windsor into a more centralized source so that people can access it, a centralized digital source so that people can access it, share it, whatnot, without having to be limited by the physical restrictions of, like, say, not being in Windsor or not being in Canada or what have you. So that's really important. Um, I would say in the short term, interestingly, I found that social media has, social media platforms have been very important for us in kind of being able to share information and also in a way to actually archive some of our own activities. For instance, if the Jackson Park Project has a YouTube channel, if you were to go there, we have recordings of kind of sessions like these where we were able to record and share them, or other discussions and talks that we've had with various people in the community. And in a way right now, that serves as an archive of our work while we are still working on building up like a more stable and long-term archive. So that's in the short term, that's kind of how that's been functioning in a way that I didn't expect. And in the long term, the world of digital content management systems is wide and vast, and there's a lot I've been kind of like going through there, but I've still been trying to think about how we can get that material out now, before we move to kind of the more permanent solution.
Okay, thank you. Melissa.
Yeah, so archives have increasingly been creating digital spaces as well, similar to what Tonya was saying. So the Archives of Ontario has been using Flickr, YouTube, Wikimedia Commons, for example, and there's Black collections on all of those platforms, and they are quite heavily used. Um, in my work specifically, I work in the collections development and management unit. So my work is more specifically about the appraisal, description, and access of materials. So like preparing records for access. So I don't deal with Wikimedia Commons directly, but in some areas of my work, I'm able to include it and amplify it through different venues. So I've created things like a Black History Research Guide. I've created a few workshops at the Archives of Ontario, and I share these resources with attendees who maybe would not find these materials online, but because they're coming to the archives or they're using our website, that's another way for them to access these materials.
Mhm. And thanks for that. For myself, I could chime in briefly. It's been a huge learning curve in terms of accessing digital materials, but also using digital tools in my research. I've gone from kind of photocopying and stacking papers to, to transitioning to having things scanned and stored properly. And when I did my first book on Emancipation Day, commemorations in Canada, was my first large research project, and had to find a way to keep all the materials in order, so that you can always go back to them. I found using things, and now my research on Black people who were enslaved in early Ontario, having to manage such a large data set, I started to begrudgingly have to use Excel. So I've become more proficient in using Excel, and I've gotten a lot of help with that. And then I want to share my research, which will be another stage coming soon in creating a database. And so now I've also had to learn how to use that kind of digital tool as something to help share my research. So it's helped me to manage my research, but then will also be important in helping to make it accessible. And then social media has been amazing in terms of getting the word out, in terms of the work that I've been doing, getting people more interested in events and different kinds of things taking place. And then when we were in the pandemic, and we were in the lockdown, we couldn't go anywhere. All of us became proficient on Zoom and Teams, and we were able to continue the kinds of conversations that we would have generally in person, right, in regards to Black history. And so I definitely see that some of these tools, social media, helps to reach beyond are very immediate spaces, and it's gone internationally, and you get a lot of interest from different places where maybe post-pandemic there may not have been that kind of an interest. And so I can definitely see a lot of benefit in the various digital tools. What about Wikipedia? What are your observations on Wikipedia as a tool, but also as a source of information? I'll just start briefly in that last year, my fourth year class, one of their assignments was to contribute to the Wikipedia-a-thon last year to help to expand some of the articles on Black Canadian history, or to start new entries. And I found that students were very engaged in that. And I'm also very pleased over the past few years to see how much the material has become more refined and more accurate. And so I know previously people would say, well, don't use Wikipedia, but you can use it, and use it as a beginning stage. You can, go to the sources being cited, and you can now, and through this kind of event, for example, contribute to the increase in stories of Black Canadians. So what are your thoughts on that, Tonya?
Yeah, I think Wikipedia is great. I was definitely of the school generation of the like, don't let me see you put Wikipedia on your works cited, which still to an extent is totally fair. But realizing that the usually at the bottom of the article, the citation list itself, the like other sources, further reading, additional reading, etc. Those can be a really, really great jumping off point for your research, because they literally hand you, hopefully several sources that you can then kind of go from there. I also really enjoy kind of the relational kind of functioning of Wikipedia, and that of course being able to link to other topics or like things within the text that will take you to another page about whatever, the Wikipedia rabbit hole of kind of going through the links and going further and further from what you had initially clicked on. But I just think the ability that it allows you to discover content and discover relationships like between content that you might not have seen just like looking at a single source on its own is really great.
Mm-hmm. Melissa?
Yeah, I have used Wikipedia a few times in my work at the Archives of Ontario to update information to make it clear that there's collections at the Archives of Ontario that can be accessed. I think like Wikipedia as a tool, it helps to democratize who is remembered, right? And for some people, it is a form of activism. They're correcting the narrative and they are inserting stories that are forgotten. So I think it is a really powerful tool in that way. And as you said, Natasha, a lot of people have been working to make Wikipedia more accurate. And so that it is really a source that we can use, even if it's just a starting point to our research. And as Tonya said, there's lots of citations in there as well, so it can direct you to other resources, which is really helpful. And it just helps to bring more visibility to these things, more than an archival institution can do. There's far more reach. Our Wikimedia Commons page gets far more exposure than our online catalog, right? A lot of people don't necessarily think to go on Archives of Ontario website and then go on the catalog, but they'll go on Wikimedia, they'll go on Wikipedia, and that's a way for them to discover information and even correct things that we might upload, right? So they could say, we're going to reclaim this narrative and say, this is how this story should be told. So I think that is a really, really powerful thing.
What suggestions do you have for people who are new to Wikipedia? Suggestions on researching, writing, and surfacing Black Canadian histories and experiences. Tonya?
Yeah, I would say, as I kind of touched on in my last answer, really embrace kind of the relational potential of the content on Wikipedia. Like, do explore, like I said, the additional sources, the hyperlinks that will take you to kind of related topics. And I would say, in terms of the researching and writing of, like, say, history in general, but especially history of a community that's kind of historically, been marginalized or minimized, like historically not brought to the forefront in history telling, is obviously you usually go into research with some kind of a question or something that you want to know or answer, but not to let your assumptions or even your questions lead you around within the research to the point where you might then dismiss other areas or directions because you think that on its face they're not going to be related. For instance, I can tell you that I worked at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center. There are a few records that I worked on that do pertain to some Black Canadian history. In that one of the men whose question I was working on stopped and stayed in Chatham for a while in the 1940s, and took some pictures and things. You would not assume that would be at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, but when you actually start looking, it can be kind of surprising what you're able to uncover. So I just say, like, really staying open to the potential and the unexpected. That would be my advice.
Yeah, that's an amazing example. Thank you, Tonya. Melissa?
Um, I'd say in a similar light, you have to be creative when you're doing research, right? The ways that our lives have been documented has been through the white perspective largely. And so you have to be creative to think like, how would we have been documented and where would these stories be? Which archives would have these materials? Who would have been writing about this? And so you have to really change the way you're thinking about it. It's not as simple as doing, a Google search. You have to really dig into finding different sources and different institutions that might be holding these collections, even different individuals within the Black community that might have materials that you could use in your research. And I would say in terms of like writing, seeing what you write as an ongoing process, not seeing it as something that's final. seeing it as something that's participatory. There's this concept in archives called participatory description, which is the idea that we involve communities in the descriptions of records that document their lives and their communities. So as much as you are, editing for activism, also understanding that it's a collaborative process and other people will be editing as well, and that just enriches the stories even more.
Wow, yes, thank you. Something that I think both of you have touched on in your last responses was the broad matter of power and the way that power has shaped um, the kinds of records that we have on Black Canadian history, how we can access some of these resources, and then also power shapes how we are able to um, write about or disseminate in various ways these stories. So, what are your thoughts on power and the challenges that power imbalances has created in just broadly in relation to Black Canadian histories? And so, what are your general thoughts on that? How have you maybe encountered it? How can we help to reduce some of these some of the barriers that power then it causes in the work that we do?
Mhm.
Melissa?
So in archives, in most cases, what records are there about the Black experience are the extremes. It's either Black people as objects, as property, or Black people who are seen as extraordinary and excellent. And so there's not a lot of the everyday Black ordinariness that's documented in the archives. And that's a problem because that shapes the way we see ourselves as Black people and the way that society sees us, that these are the only ways that we exist and that nothing else that exists in between matters. But those everyday experiences do matter. Those are the experiences that bond us and help us create our identities. So that is one of the ways that I think power has shaped the way that our narratives show up in the archives, because of the history of collecting practices in archives, because of the history of record creation. White people were more likely to have access to resources to create their own documents and put it in an archive. Um, and I think that digital tools like Wikipedia is a really great way for empowering communities to tell their own stories and to, as I said, correct the stories that institutions tell on these digital spaces.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. Tonya?
Yeah, I think hearing the question kind of power, Natasha, my brain is kind of also going in um, the direction of, I suppose, authority and authority in storytelling and like the idea of like who gets to tell the story. But
Mhm.
one thing that has come up, I know, in like our work at Jackson Park is being conscious of the power dynamics of, you know, telling history or sharing history. Obviously, when you're working with like community focused history, the lives of people, their families, especially in more recent times when either many people are still alive or, this was like recently that they would have been alive. Um, Trying to operate with the mindfulness of um, of being of being an outsider in the case of like say you're not a member of this person's family or whatnot, who wants to share about this person, dealing with navigating the kind of challenges of, sorry, my words are like not wanting to form right at this moment, but the challenges of the idea that maybe someone is saying like, say this is my history, this is like my family, whatnot, and maybe Do they have the final word in what exactly is said or described or whatnot about that family? Why or why not? Again, just kind of like that whole, the power dynamic between the person who wants to be doing the kind of archiving and the person or people, the community that history is about. Just trying to navigate that relationship. It's individual between everyone who you interact with, of course. That's something that we've just like been exploring as we go through the process of like working on our process with Jackson's part. So sorry, I don't have like a it's just something.
No, that's a good example. Yes, you previously in your one of your last answers had talked about mentioned stories that have been marginalized and groups that have been marginalized, and that is a prime example of the power of power, if you will, right? Which stories get to become the dominant narrative, and which stories then become those in the margins or on the periphery of these dominant stories. And we know that, there's been a lot at play in terms of, European colonization, and those kinds of historical processes, which I had touched on earlier in my opening, that have not only shaped how Black people have come to be here, but even in the kinds of stories that are told and documented about us in very limited ways. And so, we have generations of people who have been telling stories of Black Canada, in many different ways. One of the ways that we have continued to challenge this exertion of power is in the act of telling the stories, but also in the ways that we tell the stories. And so we've had people who've published books, which was obviously, a prime example, telling stories in the newspapers. I also see that the work that we are doing in more contemporary times is an effort to disrupt these uneven power dynamics. And so by using social media, by using Wikipedia, and Melissa had talked about, democratizing knowledge and information, that these are important tools that we can use. I also see power playing out, that there is the power, then what we are challenging is the power of quote unquote tradition, right? Where there are these structures of these are the stories that are important about Ontario, about Canada. This is how you quote unquote do history. This is how you should be telling stories. But because our stories have been relegated to the margins, right? That we have had to be creative and find different ways of extracting those stories and using the margin both as a site of resistance, but also exerting our energy to say our stories are also deserving of being part of the wider dominant narrative. So there's also that power of tradition that is often at play. An example of that is sometimes getting comments around how things have always been, or a specific example, my research around slavery and my effort to center those people as men, women, and children. That has not the traditional way that slavery has been approached, and the enslavement of Black people. As Melissa said, they've all, been enslaved Black people have just been treated as objects, as commodities. And so there are some people who are not comfortable with centering, right? Changing the power dynamics in the storytelling and centering Black people, because then it also then reflects back on the dominant narrative, on the tradition of doing things. And so these are things that we in our work, I think, I think you may also have to contend with those kinds of things as you work towards challenging the tradition, challenging the power structure, and doing things in new ways. With Melissa, in the archives, talk about a colonial institution and the work that you want to do, and how that is very much doing things differently than the tradition, or thinking about tradition in a different way. And then, Tonya, with the work that you're doing in the Jackson Park project as well. and kind of in resurrecting and keeping alive the story where people may be content with having it just kind of, fizzle out. That these are some of the things that we have to contend with. So then what does that mean for you? I'm going to expand this question. So what has that meant for you personally? Because it's something that we are cognizant of and that we are always walking into having to deal with. So what has that meant for you personally, and how do you prepare yourself and take care of yourself, knowing that you're always challenging these power structures in the effort to get to and to tell stories of Black people?
Mm. I think for me, I've been very fortunate because in my journey, in my career, I have found so many archivists and historians and researchers who have been very supportive. Um, and, the work that I do in the Archives of Ontario and the work that I do outside of it, you know, I very rarely encounter someone that, challenges me because I am trying to change the tradition. Um, so I think my experience might be different from some other archivists who are doing this work, but it does mean, it means a great deal to me to be able to do this type of work and have this type of reception to it, and to work in a colonial institution, as you said, but work with colleagues and managers who are very open and supportive of my ideas. And to be able to do this work at an institution, I think is really important because, we need archives. They are the only institutions that are truly able to preserve things long term. And if we're preserving things in community, that's great. And we can do that. But long term, it's going to be challenging if we don't at least have the support or some sort of relationship with institutions. So that's why for me, I think it's really important to change the way that archives are functioning and make them more community centered, make them more respectful, make them more inclusive.
Yeah, well, excellent. Thanks, Melissa. Tonya?
Yeah, I think if for a two-pronged response, I guess how I try to, you know, contend with power dynamics in my own work, um, thinking about it, I've kind of been trying to orient myself so that my focus is also on, how do I and we Jackson Park like share this history without speaking over people, or trying to, certainly like trying not to position ourselves as being like, well, we're the authority on this. We know all there is to know. Only talk to us, right? Um, so rather more so, it's like, why not try to use whatever power or influence or whatnot that we have to connect with and uplift and like support other people and other people who are, doing the same work or similar work kind of in related fields. And so like kind of it's like, taking the time to try and learn to understand the lay of the land, if you will, making connections with people, learning about their projects, maybe learning about where you can collaborate, or if not, you can kind of refer them or connect them to someone else who could be relevant, to their work, and being able to kind of like do some community building that way. Um, for myself personally, like of like how do the question of like how do you care for yourself or kind of deal with some of these challenges? Um, I would say, Melissa, maybe hopefully it's not as rare as like it could be, because when I talk to people about Jackson Park or Black Canadian history, I am pretty much always met with like excitement and almost like a sense of like wonder, for a lot of people being like, I didn't know about, all of this, and, the stereotype that perhaps Canadian history might not be the most scintillating or riveting, topic to learn about. So people are often really, really receptive to learning about it, which is really good. And I think in a way that then also creates like the cycle of what I just said, where I'm now able to connect and build relationships with people, learn about them, learn about their interests, maybe to say, hey, you're really excited about this? Well, maybe you should read this book, Emancipation Day, or you should talk to this person, or, what have you. And so I think that those kind of two attitudes together,
Mhm.
do help kind of push back against some of the more challenging, I was going to say depressing
Mhm.
challenges of trying to tell stories of like underrepresented people in very traditional, again, like for instance, archives and the museum. Can be a problem. Trying to kind of push back against some of those structures that keep this history being from being represented as it should be. Yeah.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Working in community is something that is very important in the work that we do. Because yes, we have to take and be well versed in traditional approaches and the institutions and whatnot, but we also have to do non-traditional things. And I think it was Melissa who talked about, what kinds of questions are we asking about where sources may be. You have to really kind of sometimes come out of the box. And so working with people, building those relationships is something that's very integral for myself, either on research or in regards to my teaching, having relationships with, for example, Amherstburg Freedom Museum or Buxton Museum or Chatham Museum. The tremendous work that these organizations do, the work that a lot of us do is not possible without their efforts. And so we have to, we have to kind of work in tandem and work together for towards the common goal of expanding our preservation and sharing of these stories. So what is maybe one or two challenges that you have faced in your research, writing, and surfacing Black Canadian histories and experiences, and what have you learned from that experience? Uh,
I think
Melissa?
I'm not sure if I would say it's like so much of a challenge, but realizing the limitations to my own knowledge, you know. So as you know, I was working on this research guide, the Black Histories Research Guide, and I wanted to list and identify and list, certain types of records relating to different themes. And I said, I don't know that much about slavery in Canada. So I asked, can I consult with Natasha Henry Dixon? You know? So I think, yeah, realizing the limitations to your knowledge, and it's okay to collaborate, to do research and learn from other people. But I would say, you know, also like this work is slow, and it sometimes needs to be slow,
Yes.
because you have to take time to do it right, and also be open to doing it again and correcting it and seeing it, as I had said, seeing your descriptions or whatever it is you're working on as a living document. You're going to constantly have to revise it and update it and add to it as the years go on. Like Natasha had said, the language that is used to describe slavery has shifted dramatically over the last few years, right? And that's something that I talk about in my work is, using the word enslaved as opposed to using the word slave, using the word enslaver as opposed to using the word master. Language really carries a lot of meaning and has a lot of power. And for a lot of people, that's completely new information.
Mhm.
Right. So, language is gonna change. And sometimes we're gonna look back and say, you know what, that was really, that language was coming from outside of the community. And now we're saying, collectively, this is not how we want to describe this. This is the language we want to use instead. And we have to be open to that change.
Yes, absolutely, definitely. Tonya, what about you?
Yeah, I think to add on to what Melissa said there, I think it's very apt to say, like, this work is slow. Sometimes it needs to be, but it is a challenge, certainly recognizing and kind of dealing with the slowness and the resource intensity of this kind of work. For Jackson Park, it is a challenge for us because at this moment, we're a very small group and we're doing this kind of like on a volunteer basis. So it's something that you have to fit, in between all the other things that you're doing. And when that's the case, sometimes it feels like your progress, your movement is very small. So that is a challenge of like, how do we us work on how can we expand our capacity so that we kind of can see maybe have more time, have more resources to do that work, while simultaneously also trying to at least do some of the work is something that we're always trying to, like, it's a constant balancing act within our team. Bringing it back to the whole thing of research and whatnot, definitely I think a lot about you could have the most amazing content in your archive or your museum or whatnot, but if people can't discover it, if they can't find it, it might as well not exist. And that's not just say, you know, you got to put an entire archival collection like fully online or whatnot, but
you know, the archivist or whoever, can they find the information if a researcher approaches them, for instance? And sorry, my microphone disconnected there. Can you still hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to fix it in a minute, but yes. So, archives, other record holding institutions, developing or switching your record system over to like a really robust framework that is easy to navigate, easy to like find things, easy to find accurate information about things. That's a really big task, but it really, really impacts, I would say, like the usability of the information that you're holding. So I'm always kind of thinking about in both the institutions that like I work in and with Jackson Park of like, how do you kind of set up your framework so that the users are actually able to interact with your information in a meaningful way? And it's a big challenge.
It's a huge challenge because that requires resources and finances, right? And how do you being able to scan the materials in a way that the metadata is searchable and easy findable. I just spent last night I think 3 hours going through pages on Canadiana Heritage Database trying to find a record. And I still haven't found it. So that's 3 hours, but it is painstaking.
Oh my gosh.
And it would be great just to be able to type in the name or a key term and, you know, and have so some options come up to reduce the time. So it's, you know, that in an ideal world, you know, our governments and whatnot would see the tremendous value like we do in these materials and want to invest and give them the resources so that we can do this kind of work. And as you said, both of you said that it takes a lot of time to surface a lot of these stories. And so you know, accessing the materials and then how do you interpret these stories? And I can say for myself, you know, some of the stories that I've been telling about some of the Black people who were enslaved in Upper Canada, that I've called it now, I've likened it to like a process of marinating where you gather some of the materials and how do they connect? How do they create a timeline? How can you build their story? And then there's questions that kind of populate in your head about, you know, oh, did I ask this? How can I fill this part of their life in if it's possible? So it's definitely a painstaking process. It's something for me that I enjoy. I find it to be so fulfilling, especially when you're able to share a story, like these fragments that you're able to pull together to tell a story. And then, as you say, Tonya, for people to be so interested in the stories that you're telling, it definitely is, for me, it is fulfilling. And so there will always be, I think, you know, realistically, those challenges in accessing materials as we become and continue to become more proficient, as technology and digital tools are more necessary in the operations of archives and other institutions, libraries, that hopefully will help to make the kinds of work that we do a bit easier. But there will always be a lot of time and labor of love involved in these stories. And so my last question, we talked about some of the challenges. What's some of the successes that you've had And in your research, in your writing, and in your surfacing of some of the stories that you've been telling, maybe more recently or something in the past, yeah, what are some of the successes that you've had? I'll start with Tonya and then Melissa.
Sure. Yeah, I've had some really great successes kind of over the process of being a part of Jasmine's part. I would say I was pretty happy with, if we're talking about kind of like a holistic research project, back in 2022, what is time, I think. I was part of a partnership with Ontario Culture Days, where as a creative in residence was the title there, but we took the idea of that being a kind of a researcher and a historian is also a type of creative, with the kind of history telling. I ended up kind of doing this project that was exploring research into like the food history around Emancipation Day celebrations and parades, because that was a pretty big thing. Food's a big part of any good part of your celebration. And a lot of the ideas that we've talked about, because, there's no Emancipation Day parade cookbook, so I had to go into the features thinking to myself, what questions am I going to ask? Like what sources, like what material could give me information about this topic that maybe I wouldn't be expecting. And that led me in a few really interesting directions. And one thing that I was really, really happy about was that I was able to connect with Eileen Harding Davis. I'll double check her name.
Yeah.
A historian, yes, okay. Who historian in Windsor, who not only her family was very involved in running Emancipation Day celebrations, but her family was also is also one of the keepers of the famous rib sauce, barbecue sauce that went on the ribs at Emancipation Day. These are spoken about in records. And she was able to talk to me. We did an oral history interview, which again is on our Jackson Park YouTube page, which I think the link will get shared to that later. This really fascinating interview talking to her about, the importance of like food and cooking in her family, how she thinks that relates to, the community in Windsor, the Black community in Windsor, the celebrations. And it was just really great to be able to have that kind of human connection. Sometimes when you're doing history, it's easy to forget that like these are just people, like everyday people, throughout time. And talking to her really kind of brought that history alive to me in a way that just kind of reading about it in a book or whatnot might not have. So that's something that I think about a lot, that I was really happy that I was able to do by talking to her, but also to share by recording and be able to post it like on YouTube for other people to be able to perhaps learn about that as well. And that's something that I've really I felt really good about. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you. Before you go, Melissa, just wanted to get the audience to think about, as we wrap up our conversation, if they have any questions for the panelists, if you can, start to think about them, and there's a Q&A feature that you can put your questions in, and then I'll get to them at the end of our conversation so we can ask them for you. Melissa.
Yeah, I like what you said, Tonya, about remembering that our work is also about people. And I think that's something that I've really been doing in my work as well. So I like to say that my work centers Black being and belonging. So I always think about Black researchers and Black communities. And so, as I mentioned, I finished the Black History Research Guide, which was the first Black Histories research guide the Archives of Ontario created. And I'd say most archival institutions in Canada do not have a research guide. Some of them have some sort of resource that indicates that they have some materials about Black history, but mine is the most comprehensive that I've seen. And I think, the fact that a lot of institutions don't have a research guide really just reinforces our invisibility in this country. And it really signals that we're not important enough to, create research guides about. And I understand through meeting different Black researchers and historians over the years that them not having any kind of guide that they could go to or not enough resources that they can go to makes their work so much harder. And then a lot of archivists don't understand anything about Black history. They don't have a lot of experience helping Black researchers. So I'm always thinking about how can I make their work a little bit better, a little bit easier? How can I make them feel more like they belong and that they're thought of and they're considered? And I think I've been able to do a lot of that at the Archives of Ontario and outside of the Archives of Ontario as well. So that's something I'm really proud of.
Thank you. For myself, briefly, one success that I'm proud of is always being able in some way to give back to some of the organizations who have dedicated their time, a lot of time, volunteer as well, to preserving Black history. And so some of the work that I do in my class is ensuring that in some way my students can contribute something back to these organizations, whether it's in helping to transcribe some records or sharing some information. This year, my students are going to be contributing a blog post on some images in a library collection to help interpret the Black experience. So that's something that I really am proud of, and I think is important in the kinds of work that I do. And then lastly, with my research on enslaved Black people in Upper Canada, surfacing stories of Black women and children and men. But some of the stories that I've been able to kind of tell, I'm looking forward to sharing with the public. And it'll oscillate in terms of which stories I really am connected to. But one story is a story of a Black woman who was brought in enslaved during the American Revolution, gained her freedom. She was manumitted, obtained some land. She was married to or in partnership with a man who remained enslaved. And if you can think about, late 1790s, that this Black woman, one of the few who would have been freed at that time in that space in Eastern Ontario, took it upon herself to get a letter, petition written and submitted on the behalf of her man and said he should have his freedom. And, to think about, the structures of white male power and the elite and the military officers. And here she is, lobbying for her man's freedom. And we can hear her voice, right? And that insistence of his liberation. For me, these stories haven't been told. And so I find that as a success, and no matter how much in a small way to tell these stories, that it's successful in the fact that we're able to kind of weave them together and to tell them. And so I think I want to commend all three of us for the work that we have been doing and continue to do. It will help to shed more perspective on the Black Canadian experience. And so our conversation today, gave people a bit of a glimpse into the kinds of the work that we do, why we do it, and why people should be more interested in Black history, and also contributing in some way, whether it's through Wikipedia, helping to build some of the materials there, engaging with the different kinds of work that different individuals are doing. Again, as I wanted to thank you both for this time to have this conversation. It's a great way for us to another space for us to have this kinds of conversation during Black History Month, but also of course, all year round. So it's been great to speak with you. And I'm now going to take a look at the Q&A to see if people from the audience might have questions for us. So there's Connor who asked about if they wanted to get in touch with the panelists, what's the best way to do so?
For me, I'd say you can just contact the Archives of Ontario and just ask for me. And yeah, unless I can share my email with everyone after, but yeah.
For me, I'm available through the York University directory. My email is available through that. Tonya?
Yeah, I think for me, an email sent to jacksonparkproject@gmail.com. I'm gonna send it. Will reach me, but I don't know if you wanna message me on LinkedIn or something. You can just search my name. But contacting Jackson Park, you can definitely get in touch with me and my other colleagues as well.
Mhm. Connor had another question. I think this is actually a great question. He asked, what is a source of information that you tend to use a lot or would recommend for people to check out as a starting point for learning more about Black Canadian history?
Mm,
I can start while you're thinking. I have so many,
yeah.
but I have, because I've always gotten this question from educators, my time in the classroom, elementary and high school levels, and just more broadly, I created a website teaching African Canadian history. So I always try to it's a compilation of all different kinds of materials that are available on Black Canadian history. And so that website, Teaching African Canadian History, is a good starting point. I think it has different kinds of materials that I've put together, documentaries, websites, teaching materials, places, some archival sources that you can tap into. So I would suggest that.
Yeah, just to add to that, I'd say also like read literature from Black Canadians. So I started reading a few books from Christina Sharp, um, just as an example. But yeah, there's lots of Black Canadians that have authored books, and I think learning from their perspective, the ways that they describe their lives and the lives of other Black people is really insightful as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, I can definitely say off the cuff, actually, Natasha's book Emancipation Day, I strongly recommend and really enjoy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think it's great just because, it is divided into kind of, or you're able to kind of search through different regions of Canada and explore the kind of history of Emancipation Day celebrations in whatever region you're interested in. But also because Emancipation Day, itself wasn't literally just a celebration of no longer being enslaved, but it was also a point, to discuss and even do activism around, what are our rights as Black Canadians? How do we how are we as citizens able to participate in Canadian society? It's a very it's a jumping off point, or it's entering point into a lot of conversations about topics in Black Canadian history. So I think it's really great. You can get it
Yeah.
on Kindle. A lot of local libraries carry it, I noticed, or at least the ones near me. And you can also of course buy it. So truly, to me, I think it's a very good text if you want to get started on the subject.
Thank you. Your last point actually ties in well with another question asked by Aisha. Today is Trayvon Martin's heavenly birthday. What role do you think the archives play in making connections to liberation movements? I connected to your statement just now, Tonya, because and we look at Emancipation Day as one particular day that commemorates the abolition of slavery in British colonies, but it was part of, as you mentioned, and as I outline in my book, part of the a movement for Black lives, and so what that has meant different things over the course of time, from during slavery to the abolition of slavery in different places, all the way through to the 21st century and the moment of the movement of the Black Lives Matter movement. So for me, I see that as absolutely archives play an important role in documenting these stories and all of the kind of archival materials. And there are many, and I know Melissa, I think will maybe touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I mean, archives hold evidence, right? So from that perspective, a lot of archives can play a role in liberatory movements because they hold evidence for these different movements. So, like, for example, a lot of archives have materials about residential school experiences. And so, they when they had to participate in that movement to uncover those stories and bring to light the experiences that Indigenous people had. So that's, one example. Some archives, I think, are trying to be more like activist archives in that they're trying to be more supportive of grassroots movements and make relationships, build relationships and repair relationships with different communities, different organizations that are doing grassroots activism work. So I think that's another way that archives can participate in this. But I think also, like I said, this work is slow. Archives change slowly, right? So I think there's some movement towards this, and I think there has been a transformative shift in archives. They are trying to break away from the traditions, but there's still, a lot to do, and there's still some archivists that aren't quite there yet.
Mm.
Yeah, archives, I think, can definitely have a role in liberation movements and connecting and documenting of liberation movements. I think I would say that like it does kind of depend though on like whatever the archive is, as an organization, if they have made the decision to prioritize kind of collecting a lot of this
Mm.
history. Again, for instance, I worked on a contract at the archives, Canada's the LGBTQ archives, and it is a collecting priority for them to try and collect any information about LGBTQ, activism and kind of political action. And in particular, like say while I was there, a collection came in from a organization that since that has now disbanded, I suppose. Salon Canada, they are kind of like no longer active as of like 2022, and so they are not still currently engaging in that work, but the archives was able to get some of their records and some of their like objects and things that they produced during their existence, and them being cataloged in the system means that people are still able to discover and learn about them, their history, their participants, who again, because they were active until 2022, are still, around, even if they're not necessarily doing that work, but the potential for people to then be able to reach out to, connect with, or even just to learn more about something that would otherwise kind of have been lost once this organization decided to stop operating. So I think it can be really important.
Definitely. Just two quick examples. Another archive that comes to mind is the Rise Feminist Archive. And their online sources, the access is amazing. For our conversation, Black women of varying backgrounds and social identities are part of that archives. So there's that. The Archives of Ontario, other archives may have sometimes news footage, old news footage, different kinds of materials. There are in the Alvin McCurdy collection of the Archives of Ontario, Wilma Morrison collection. There are collections that actually people may have snipped newspaper articles or have pictures and whatnot that help to tell the story of Black activism throughout our time. And then lastly, some of the films at the National Film Board are absolute gems in terms of documenting Black activism in Canada. And so films are also in the documentaries and the work that people, for example, like Charles Officer, who passed away, Hungry Eyes Media, and others, the recent documentary, Black Life, those are also important documentation and archival materials, and using archival materials to tell the story of Black liberation movements. And so there's a wealth of information for you to tap into. The last question that we have is from Catherine, asking, are there any grant and sources that focus on supporting Black history initiatives? And what has been the experience and challenge in accessing funds to develop in the development of archives and research in Black history?
I think I have a unique experience because I work for a government archive. So the government funds all the work that we do. I don't think we've ever applied for grants, and I have no experience applying for grants, so I'm not sure what the landscape is. Um, But I would say that, the government has been supportive of different initiatives that we've wanted to do. Right now, we're working on a new exhibit that I'm curating, and I'm calling it Reclaiming Black Memory, and it's going to focus on Black experiences as told through Black voices. And, we were told that we should make this as big as we can, and we want to involve different communities and different institutions, and really use this as an opportunity to start a deeper discussion about Black histories and Black archives and the importance of our stories.
Mhm. Tonya, did you have?
Yeah, because so I guess on the flip side, as kind of like a small volunteer organization, trying to secure funding through particularly grants and things like that is a really big priority for Jackson Park. And it is a challenge because there's a reason that being a grant writer or like a fundraising person is a full-time job or maybe even a department's job depending on the size of your institution. Because it's a lot of even just the sheer information and research you have to do to navigate, never mind the writing, etc. Yes, for someone looking in general, I would say that looking at kind of like government funding at different levels could take you to these places. So, for instance, through Libraries and Archive Canada, they do different funding and things for different heritage organizations or initiatives. So you might be able to find things that way. The government of Ontario does have different kind of funding streams as well. You just have to kind of look there are things that are like more general that could be applied to a project relating to Black history, and then there are some things that might be like more targeted to particular communities. I know, for instance, there is outside of the government there, supporting Black Canadian Communities Initiative is a organization, I believe, who does seek to fund nonprofits and charities who want to do work with Black Canadian communities, and there's a variety of grants available through them. So they do exist. Unfortunately, it's just kind of like you need to have the time and the wherewithal to sit and find them and talk to people and write things, and yeah.
For myself, just quickly before I turn it over to Rayanne, I've tended to more work on projects that people have secured the funding for, but I found that putting forth projects where a goal is working collaboratively is something that funders look favorably upon. So that's something to think about in terms of I guess, thinking about the impact of the dollars that they may be contributing, something to think about in that regards. But funding absolutely is something that can remain an obstacle for some of the kinds of work and recovery work that we are aiming to do. So thank you once again, Melissa and Tonya, and I'm going to turn it over to Rayanne.
Thank you.
Are you talking, Rayanne, or I'm
Okay.
just... Oh, okay.
I'm going to start talking now. I just had to share the slides again, and then
I just wanted to make sure you weren't just talking and you were on mute.
no, it happens all the time. So as we draw this enlightening session to a close, I want to express our deepest gratitude to our esteemed panelists, Melissa and Tonya, and our moderator, Natasha, for the invaluable insights and contributions. The dedication to enriching our understanding of Black Canadian experiences through research, archives, and digital storytelling educates and inspires us to actively preserve and share these vital narratives. Today's discussions have underscored the importance of platforms like Wikipedia and Wikidata in democratizing information and providing a space where Black experiences in public history are not only visible, but celebrated. We've dived into the challenges and successes of researching, writing, and surfacing Black Canadian histories, offering practical advice for new and seasoned Wikipedians alike. As we move forward, let's carry with us the inspiration to see ourselves as researchers, creators of memory, and contributors to the ever-evolving tapestry of public history. The journey does not end here. It's just beginning. We invite everyone to join the Edit-a-thon and apply what you've learned today and continue making impactful contributions to representing Black experiences in public domains. Thank you to each participant for your questions and for attending this event. To follow today's excellent panel, there will be a Black-only discussion space from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. This event is intended for members of the Afro-diaspora only, where the discussion will focus on themes from the panel, as well as wider themes on Blackness and information. We would like to invite everybody else to register at the event's website and join the upcoming Edit-a-thon sessions. Until next time, keep researching, questioning, and most importantly, editing. Your contributions are making a difference. Thank you.